three basics. One, I'm going to say that mainstream economics, basically neoclassical fusion, has a correct view of the individual. Number two, it cannot account for radical innovation. And number three, I'm going to argue that human choice is fundamentally undecidable and therefore unpredictable.
Okay. Is it so now I talk now?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I don't really know what I guess we're going to find out. I don't really know what you think, neoclassical economics is, but I mean, I think the basic foundations of it are pretty reasonable. I mean, that we can use supply and demand to describe a lot of things. I mean, I think that I mean, we could talk about it on the level of like just random, if I were to pull, random thoughts like, oh, if the demand for, coffee at my coffee shop goes up, because Taylor Swift endorses my coffee, and I don't raise the price, well, we'll still see something. We'll still see evidence of like the equilibrium price going up, because if I don't raise the price at the shelf, I might have lines out the door. I think that the fundamentals, that we generally observe, that when you lower the price of something, people buy the price of something, people buy less of it. Demand curves sloping down, supply curves sloping upward. If the price of something gets bid up, it incentivizes more people to provide that thing. I guess I don't really know. I guess I don't really know yet what I'm defending, because I guess I'm in a sense defending the usefulness of economics. So I guess we'll find out, more specifically what your critiques are, and then I can address them on a more individual basis.
I think my critiques would be more on a macro level. So I think there's been a few instances in the recent history. The two ones that really stick out to me are stagflation and the financial crisis, where economics presented itself as this predictive model that is able to solve, the problems of, I guess, social distribution, but it failed to do so. And this is because it views itself as a series of law-like generalizations that supposedly have predictive power, but inevitably implementing these things, it's kind of recursive. So it like you will try to apply it within the system, but it can't account for things that extend from outside of the system.
So you talked about stagflation. So in what way does economics not describe stagflation well?
Yeah.
What
So
is
I think
stagflation? Can you define it first?
it would be a situation where inflation is rising, but unemployment is, or sorry, employment is not rising as well. So it would be
Okay.
where you are having a recession at the same time as inflation is rising. Which
So
I
what
think,
causes? Yeah. So.
well, from what I understand, the Phillips curve described that is if inflation is rising, then employment would rise at the same time, right?
So the Phillips curve. I mean, the Phillips curve is hotly debated within economics. I mean, the Phillips curve held for
Real
a
quick though,
while. Yeah, go ahead.
it wasn't debated at the time though, right? So my point is that it wasn't
Sure. I
able to
mean,
predict this.
sure. I mean, the Phillips curve, if anything, just describes economic expansions. I mean, I can draw. I mean, I have a textbook in front of me. I mean, stagflation is when there's a supply shock. So they weren't considering, before we knew about stagflation, I suppose we didn't know about supply shocks, I guess. I mean, we're kind of, I mean, gosh, like if we're talking about modern economics, I mean, you're talking about like a shortcoming of economics, 60 years ago, before we were even like doing it on computers, before the empirical, revolution in economics happened. I mean, I can, I'll be teaching stagflation this semester. I mean, if a supply shock happens, like supply and demand curves perfectly describe stagflation. If I could draw, I mean, I guess I don't have a, but like you could, like in your head, you can imagine like a supply and demand curve, right? Like an X, like, supply
Yeah, yeah.
slipping up. And so in a macro economy, if I replace that demand curve with the aggregate demand curve, and I replace the supply curve with the aggregate supply curve, and I say, okay, well, what about if there's a supply shock, like an oil shock, right? Like what happened in the 70s as one of the contributors to stagflation. If something happens to a major input, I mean, this is something that economics, I think, describes perfectly well.
But it
If
didn't at the time, right?
I don't know if that's the case. I mean, I don't know for sure that it didn't at the time. I mean, we had the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Like, it would have made sense to anyone who could imagine a supply and demand curve that if you shift the aggregate supply curve left, GDP will fall and the price level will rise. Like principles of economics from 1890 could have described what stagflation would look like.
So
I mean, just
who predicted it though at the time?
well, I don't know who predicted it. I don't know for sure that no one did. I mean, I don't know if that's a very good critique of the tools, because it's like saying, like, well, if aliens come down and give us a technology that's going to cause the supply curve to shift really far to the right, and like if aliens come down and give us a technology that revolutionizes the way we make things, and it makes it so that GDP explodes while price levels fall drastically. It's like, just because nobody predicted that happening doesn't mean that like the model doesn't still accurately describe it.
So I'll give
Because,
so this would be my second point, is that economics and social sciences in general, this isn't a critique of economics specifically, but none of them have predictive power, and this is what distinguishes them from what we call the natural sciences, because they actually do. So
Mhm.
when you have a law like the law of thermodynamics,
Yeah.
even up to the point with quantum mechanics, nothing has changed those fundamental laws. They still have predictive power. But when we have these sociological, economic, anthropological arguments, there's always counterfactuals to them and they always get disproven. And to me, that means that we need to be really cautionary when we're trying to implement them. We can't predict these radical innovations that we have, and they can throw our whole economy out of whack. If we go and we use our traditional economics when we're trying to displace them, we're ignoring the fact that human behavior is, I guess, infinitely malleable.
Mm-hmm. Uh, yeah. I mean, I don't like. I agree with you that um the models we have in economics are not as ironclad as something like the speed of light, or the speed of gravity, like the gravitational pull of the Earth or something like that. Um, but it's not clear to me that they're not good enough most of the time, that they accurately approximate the world. And again, I mean, at the higher levels of econ, what we're concerned with. So, okay, for example, like if I, you know, like if I lower the price of my tutoring services, right? Like, I know I'm going to get more requests, right? And like, you could say, well, what if that doesn't happen? It's like, okay, well, it has. I mean, empirically, like I don't know how many. Like, I mean, I could start pulling up papers. It's like people empirically test, the fact that demand curves, for example, slope downward, and the fact that supply curves, for example, slope upward, and that we have certain kinds of industries, like decreasing cost industries, where like the long run supply curve slopes downward. And so like we have all these other, like, I guess my concern is that maybe you're thinking too much about like the principles of micro level models that we use, which are still good enough most of the time. I guess I, I'd want to focus more. So like, do you have, because there's so many things I could talk about. So it's like, do you have something specific that you think is there a particular common econ model that you believe is viewed as a law in a sense that might be wrong enough of the time that it would actually make a difference to most people? Like, do you have an example?
Even the example you gave. So, and this is going to be my second order critique, which is that when we try to model human behavior in this certain way, what economics does is it cannot distinguish fact from value. This is the realm of philosophy. This is where philosophy comes in because they can understand the relation between normative facts and descriptive facts. But economics conflates the two. So, with your example, if you lower your price of your tutoring service, this ignores the fact that we as humans might even change the demand for tutoring services itself, and we're already seeing that with AI, for example. So, radical innovation might change the entire relation between the person, their wants, their desires, and their needs. And it's not we're not able to put that into a model because it's fundamentally unpredictable.
What kind of radical innovation would affect my tutoring
Just
specifically?
give it
AI?
AI, yeah.
So wouldn't that just, and what effect would that have?
It might be the case that there's almost zero demand for your
Me as a
service.
me as a human.
Yeah,
And
so there might be
so
almost zero demand for your service because the AI is always going to be cheaper. So it
so
doesn't matter
what
how
you're
much you lower your
saying,
price.
so what you're saying is that when the availability of a substitute service increases and it's very cheap, it reduces the demand for my service.
What I'm saying is that your service no longer has a use value because
But
something
aren't you
else is
just
provided.
describing, like, you're right now, you just described like something I teach to like students in like week one. Like you're just describing
I don't think
how
no. I
you
think
just
what you're
described how the availability of a substitute affects demand. You just made a prediction
it's not even
about
a
how the avail no, but you just made like you just did economics. Like you just described a fundamental economics principle about demand. You
it's
just
not
said,
it's not a principle because it might be the case that tutoring services are no longer viable within the society. We might
yeah, but
eliminate
you're just
might
describing a
eliminate
decline in
real
demand.
quick. We might eliminate the need for academic education completely if we do a social revolution.
But
So you're it doesn't
you
can't
are
predict that.
describing
It's not a
a wait, but you are predicting that if AI
not
comes
prediction.
about,
Counterfactual. Those are different.
yeah, but you're just describing a decline in demand. Like you literally just described a decline in demand for me because a substitute service becomes available.
It's not a substitute service. Literally, there's no longer that a need for that service anymore.
You almost used the term replaced and you stopped yourself because replace is a synonym is almost synonymous to
It
substitute.
is, but that's not what I'm trying to say because I'm saying that you don't even need it anymore because we changed the social organization.
I don't know exactly what that means, but that's still you're still describing. I mean, like
I'll give you an
I don't know. I
example.
guess
Okay,
okay.
here's an example. Of what I say.
Hmm.
So prior to I think 13th century when the University of Barcelona was founded,
Hmm.
there was no demand at all for universities. Universities had no functional use for society. There wouldn't even be a reason to have a university. But once absolute monarchy started to arise and they had positions of power for people who went through institutional learning, there became a demand for that thing. But that's no one could predict that within like an economic paradigm, right? That you would have to understand like the outlying social changes in order to make that
I,
prediction.
I just don't see that as a critique of economics. I mean, that's just outside like to me that's not a critique of economics. You're just saying that a historical event happened where a market was created for something. Like nobody knew, there was no, like economics couldn't predict that I was like, when I do the supply and demand for hamburgers on the board for my students, the fact that hamburgers didn't exist 1,000 years ago doesn't invalidate what I'm doing. Like you're talking about the prediction of unknown unknowns. Nobody in economics is claiming to predict
Well,
unknown unknowns.
that's not analogous, right? So what I'm saying is that what the economist does is try to present, I guess, value-laden observations as descriptive when actually they're prescriptive, and so all you're doing is reinforcing a certain economic paradigm. What we want to do is look at alternate models and see if they actually are worth implementing. But we can't do that so long as we're stuck within this specific paradigm that you are prescribing, trying to present as descriptive.
But it is descriptive to what the example you brought up. I mean, as a counter argument, you brought up the idea that AI might replace me and make me obsolete as a tutor. You're literally just describing a substitute service coming about that reduces the demand to the point where the person with the highest willingness to pay for my service, their willingness to pay is now below my minimum willingness to accept, and now we basically have a market where at no point in the first quadrant of in our graph, at no point does the demand curve lie above the supply curve, and so there's no more equilibrium point. It's just the market doesn't exist anymore. I don't know. It just seems like
I wouldn't say that's a supply and demand issue, though, because let's go back to my example with the clerks in the 13th century, right? In order for me to predict that, I would have to predict a shift in the, I guess, philosophical paradigm of the society. You'd have to
economics
predict that.
does not. I do not claim to be able to predict shifts in philosophical paradigms in society. No economist does. It's not
But here's
economics.
the thing: is you'll argue against I've seen you, and this isn't a critique of you because I think this is everything you say. I think is totally valid within the paradigm. You'll say things like, "All we need to do is build more houses," for example, right? Because that's going to increase the supply. It's going to lower the cost because of that. But what you're not doing is thinking about like what services, how can we shift society around and change the paradigm so that maybe we don't even need to worry about the supply and demand curve. Instead, we can reorient society as having housing as a baseline.
Okay, so which of your okay, a couple of things. So I don't know which of your opening like you made like three opening points about like what your contentions were going to be. I don't know which contention this has to do with. Second thing I want to say
Paradigm
is
shift. That's the one that's
that economics can't predict a paradigm shift. I thought we were arguing about the usefulness. Okay, so
that
either
is
way,
the
all right.
useful,
So
right?
okay,
Because
so
like when we're
uh,
structuring policy for
mhm,
social policy,
yeah.
if we are always stuck in like, well, we need to make sure that it works out through, I guess, mainstream like neoclassical economics, then we're not going to be
See,
able to
I
reorient our society because we're going to be risk averse.
I think you are. I feel like you are conflating um, a particular set of ideological beliefs about how society ought to be structured, and I think you're conflating that with the descriptive nature of economics tools. So you just
Well,
said you just brought,
that was already one of my points, Eagle. So
okay,
I
but you brought
said
up a
that
point.
economics actually does that. Economics says that these two facts about human life, descriptive and prescriptive, are distinct and separate fields, and we cannot mix them. But in reality, they are all observation, all theories, all fact data is in fact theory laden, and we cannot uh, divorce the prescriptive from the descriptive.
Okay, but you said you talked about how my solution to reducing the price of housing is to increase supply. That's that economics. The model's correct. Like increasing the
No,
supply of housing reduces the price.
I'm not disputing that within this paradigm. But if the paradigm
No, but
shifted,
it's
then
not about okay. So if the paradigm shifted, and we lived in a moneyless society where houses were something that were provided by the state, let's say, and they did it, and let's say they did a good. So let's imagine they did a good job of it. even without money, there'd still be prices there'd be prices in relative terms in things. So let's say imagine a moneyless society where the government, like you're suggesting, maybe a social revolution occurs. We get a moneyless society where now we have a charter of rights that says everybody gets a housing unit. If there's
Yeah,
more
it's good.
housing units constructed, it would make it less costly to get one. If I live in Pennsylvania and they built them all in California, I'd have to take on the cost of moving to California. But if they
Well,
build
no,
more of them in my area, it reduces the cost. So again, the models still work. I mean,
we don't even have to do real quick
even if
though.
we changed the paradigm.
You don't even have to do like a Marxist like redistribution plan. We could do like a Rawlsian approach where he
Okay.
has like property owning democracy. He
Okay.
says a paradigm shift that we could have would be instead of redistributing wealth, we just redistribute means of production, right? And so basically, everyone would have like a social housing fund, a social property fund. We would all have means to their ownership. At this point, then housing it wouldn't be a issue of supply and demand because we're going to take the total resources of society and just distribute it equally among everyone. So
Mhm.
there wouldn't be like a I guess pricing issue. It would be more like how are we going to allocate the resources.
So what happens if a natural disaster destroys half the resources? What do you predict happens?
I'm not making predict. I don't think you can make predictions.
Yeah, but like I just don't understand how even after this paradigm shift, supply and demand still works. It's like again, like in this
I think we're
Rawlsian
both in the same
scenario.
boat on that. I think we're both in the same boat on that one, right? Because you have like a broken window fallacy, which is also equally controversial in economics because we can't make law like generalizations.
No, but you're just describing like even I I don't think you're substantiating how after this paradigm shift happens that supply and demand no longer accurately predict that we can no longer make accurate predictions from supply and demand.
If your whole society is allocated around providing a basis, so like you have like I guess you have total GDP or total utility, you would divide that among everyone within the society, right? So if we're gonna make the deliberate um, policy shift to make that fundamental before all other social resource allocation, and supply and demand aren't going to affect the pricing of housing because that's going to be the baseline.
In what way would it not affect the pricing of housing? If you're coming up with now there's a rationing system, and so the
It's not a
rationing
rationing
system,
system. It's not rationing. It's going to be
you're
like the total distribution is already going to be allocated to those individuals.
who?
Well, you have your total GDP and you have the individual members of society, and you're going to divide
So
that among them.
so we take all the stuff and we divide it among everybody.
In this case, it's going to be property, means of production, things like that. Yeah.
Okay, so property. So like everybody gets like a plot of land? Would that be a way? Would that be like what would happen, for example?
That's what Rawls advocates for. Yeah.
Everybody gets like maybe an equally sized plot of land?
I don't know about equally sized, but yeah, something like that.
What if I don't need any land? What do I do with it?
I mean, he's not going to have you sell it. You're going to be
I
entitled.
can't? Yeah, but I don't want it. Now what?
I mean, I don't know the specifics of his specific plan.
Well,
I'm
I
just
can
giving
just
you an
describe it
example
to
of
you. I can
paradigm
literally
shift.
use economics to describe what happens. It's like the people that don't want
Let's
as
say you
much
are
land.
say you are prohibited from selling the land.
So
You're
what
not
you're
going
now
to.
saying is that basically what you're arguing is that economics doesn't do a good job of describing some utopian authoritarian state where no one's allowed to do anything outside of this philosophical thought experiment that doesn't exist. And then
Well,
you're also saying that economics can't predict social revolutions. What system can?
I will caution you one in one sense because you're calling what I'm saying authoritarian, but
Well, I
You
don't mean to call
realize,
it authoritarian. You're saying I'm not allowed. Everybody gets a plot of land. I'm not allowed to set. Like you're just saying that like in this like total control society, there'd be a black market. Okay, now there's a black market in land. Now what?
oh, but
Can we use
you
supply and
realize
demand to describe
the same arguments were made against liberalism back in the day, right?
No, but we're
Saying, oh,
talking about whether
same exact
economics
argument. It's a
accurately.
paradigm shift, so of course it's going to be different.
If there were a
Liberal,
paradigm shift tomorrow where everybody agreed that demand curves are going to slope upward and we're all going to buy stuff the more expensive it gets, then that would contradict the law of demand because there's
but
been
you,
some. If God opened up the heavens and said, "Hey, everybody, you must buy more of stuff when the price goes up, and you must make less of stuff when the price goes up." And now demand curves slope up and supply curves slope down. It's like that. To me, it's like that's what you're saying is like, oh, economics can't predict a radical paradigm shift where everything's all topsy turvy and weird and in this like imaginary way in this thought experiment, and therefore economics is not useful.
it's happened several times, right? So, when we shifted from feudalism to liberalism, do you not think that the feudalists, the traditionalists, were making the same exact arguments as you? They were.
I don't know what arguments they were making, but I can
I
tell
know
you
what
that
arguments
supply
they were making.
but I can tell you supply and demand applied under feudalism and it applies now.
And demand did not apply in the same way no, not at all.
It didn't apply in the same. You're telling me that if there was that if somebody had a bunch like there weren't markets for things, there wasn't like, oh, if more of
What,
something
mar-
came about, it become easier to
what markets do
acquire.
you think existed under feudalism? Because feudalism is like a protectionist racket, basically. So one, uh, I guess like let's say let's use a high estimate. So like 65% of the population were serfs, right? They
Mhm.
were all producing all of their needs on a subsistence basis. The feudal lords were extracting like the other 25% for their own good, right? There was no fucking
Mhm.
market at that time period. And to the extent there was markets, they were highly tariffed in every situation. So no one was like trading to make a profit at this time. It wasn't until I would say like the 10th or 11th century when we had free cities rising about where you even have anything like I guess commodity production.
What? How did commodity production look in the free cities compared to the feudal areas?
So the free cities they abolished serfdom right away because you can't have commodity production
So
without
would
like
you
a labor force. Yeah.
did the
So
feudalists wouldn't you say like the feudalists like kind of had a lot of like interventions and like controls on the markets?
what I would say is that the free cities invented capitalism, and that's why
But
that is a
wouldn't
different paradigm.
but hold on. So hold on. So like wouldn't you agree? So a market is just anybody trading anywhere. I mean, the markets are everywhere, right? But like so wouldn't you say that the feudalists had a bunch of interventions and controls on markets and that they were less productive than, I don't know, the free cities? They were less productive than, let's say, capitalism. Isn't that
Were
something that
they?
economics predicts?
Well, no. I mean, to say they're less productive assumes that you're trading for commodity, but they were trading for, or they were
So how
producing.
much
Sorry,
food do you think a feudal serf was able to produce in a day?
how much food do I think they were able to produce in a day?
Yeah, how many carrots do you think a feudal serf could pick?
I have no clue. Do you
Okay,
know?
would you agree? No, I don't know. Do you think we could at least agree fundamentally that a feudal serf was able to harvest a lot fewer carrots than a modern farmer today?
uh, they produced less carrots, but they're only producing for themselves, so there wasn't really like an issue, so to speak.
Yeah, but their ability to produce carrots, can we fundamentally agree on the basic fact that a farmer today can harvest a lot more carrots in a day than a serf could?
Yeah, we have division of labor and technology. Yeah.
Okay, we have division of labor and technology. Would you agree that carrots are more readily available to like us than it was to our feudal serf ancestors?
Uh, yeah, sure. I
Okay,
guess that's
so
trivial though.
isn't that because technology increased and then that shifted this, and then in economics we'd say that the supply curve shifting right predicts a lower equilibrium price, which increases the quantity of carrots that get consumed by people.
The problem with that is that the price was irrelevant to the serf because they were producing for their own subsistence.
No, but it's not about. But so again, in microeconomics, prices are all relative. So we don't even have to say price. We could say relative. We could say number of labor hours. Like prices are just a tool. So we could talk about the price and the number of labor hours. One labor hour on a farm today might harvest 10,000 carrots, whereas one labor hour on a farm back then might have only harvested 100 carrots. And so the price of 100 carrots to a feudal serf might have been an hour, whereas the price of 100 carrots to me might be 10 minutes. Regardless of whether money is involved or whether it's capitalism or not, relative prices still exist, because what
Yeah,
microeconomics particularly is concerned
is
with
this
is
a Marxist?
trade-offs.
Are we making the Marxist argument right now?
I'm just making it. I mean, this is just price theory. I mean, this is pretty standard price theory. Like the we think of things in terms of trade-offs. We think of them relative to other things. So what
But
am I giving?
you're talking about the necessary labor time for the product. But I'm saying that society was organized in such a different way that these people, they're like for them an hour of labor time, well, an hour for labor time for us, way more valuable than like 5 hours of labor time for a feudal serf because we have a whole different social structure in which we exist in.
So our social structure has resulted in the rightward shift of the supply curve. Like I don't know. Again, it's still not clear to me.
That's what I'm saying is that you can't compare an hour of labor time now to an hour of labor time in feudal society because there's a difference in the value of an hour.
But I can calculate the productivity. I can find relatively we can agree that an hour today and an hour of labor today on a farm, you can harvest a lot more carrots. So again, I
But an
still am
hour is
not
more
seeing.
valuable now than it was then because you can. So like the
Okay,
amount
but
of
now we're
money.
veering into so this is now I'm not trying to this is not a debate about Marx's labor theory of value. This is a debate about the usefulness of just basic econ models. And so far, I still don't know what you've said so far that contradicts the usefulness of any fundamental econ model.
You couldn't
And
predict
I think it's
stagflation
useful.
because you had the standard model being based on the Phillips curve. Who predicted the economic crisis of 2008?
Okay, so all right, so these are two separate issues. So all right, so let's look at Phillips curve. So Phillips curve, okay. Concept used to guide macroeconomic policy in the 20th century, called into question by stagflation in the 1970s. Okay, so Phillips curve, which is one particular, model. So now we got to remember here.
It
So
was
if I
universally
look at
accepted at the time.
was it universally accepted? I don't know for sure. I'm skimming the Wikipedia page to
Pretty sure
try
it
to
was.
let's see. So okay, so yeah, so I mean a lot of people, right, so there's been some Nobels given with people like empirically, critiquing the Phillips curve and
After
you had a
stagflation.
yeah, no, I
After.
understand. I'm just skimming through. Um so yeah, I mean I don't know. So it's not clear to me that stagflation calling the Phillips curve into question then translates to this argument of like economics is not as like so useful because again, if I just go back to like the Phillips curve is one macroeconomic theory, but if I go back to supply and demand, we still haven't refuted that. We still haven't contradicted that. Like again, I can tell you that yeah, if a supply shock happened, they hadn't thought of that yet. They hadn't thought, oh, what if the supply curve shifts left? It's like it's not like the Phillips curve describes a short run phenomenon, which I think
Thing. So
relatively still.
you predicted that 30% of the population died off, and like let's say like 70 to 80% of businesses were shut down, trades were destroyed, what would you predict would happen to the economy?
If 30% of the population died, today, or like during the Black Plague.
Well, just any time. What would the economic? Because you're presenting it as a law like generalization, so it would apply equally to today. Then, right?
Well, not necessarily, because it might depend on a variety of factors. Because if the average person it contributes more to supply than they do to demand in the aggregate, then 30% of people dying would shift the supply curve left more than it shifts the demand curve left. So what you're describing is a scenario where supply and demand are both being decreased. We know what I can predict for sure is that if 30% of the population died, GDP would fall, total output would fall.
So
But
why then, in the crisis of the 14th century, did it rise? And we had the most flourishing of European economics since the 11th century revolution.
because probably some other thing happened. Like probably we'd have to look, like you're pulling up a random factoid about history that I don't know
No,
the
it's
exact
literally,
circumstances.
it's not a random factoid. It's called the miracle of the 14th century because it
Well, okay,
literally falls in the
okay,
face of all our economic predictions.
okay. I mean, I'd have to research this. I mean, again, like it like something else probably happened. I don't know. A miracle of the 14th. So where would I find this? The miracle in the
Google
14th century?
Google, yeah.
I mean, I found one book. There's a book called Violence and Miracle in the 14th Century.
Just look. Okay,
Is that
so
is that it? There's no Wikipedia page for it.
more common name would be the crisis of the 13th century, but then the 14th century recovered rapidly from it because 30% of the population died out from the Black Plague. The economies collapsed because there was a invasions from the, I think, Huns and the southern.
So before I even read about this, what I'm going to predict is that what we're going to find is that you're leaving out some other thing that happened that caused, like, I stepped away from my computer. I'm kind of pacing around right now. This is how I lecture in class anyway. So what I'm going to predict is what's going to happen is when I look into this, what I'm going to find is that a bunch of people died, and then some other event happened, like some kind of like revolution or some kind of like invention or some kind of like eureka moment or some kind of tech, or everybody got together and was like, okay, guys, all these people have died. We got to get inspired now. We got to figure something out. And then we could still apply the economic models. If all that happened was 30% of people died, then my prediction would be correct. But what you're saying, what you're probably describing is some other thing happened that I just don't know about. Because 30% of people dying, all else equal, would not cause GDP to rise. But if 30% of people die, and one of those people is like the tyrannical king who's been like raping and pillaging everybody for 1,000 years, then yeah, GDP might rise because then supply will increase or something. It's like I don't know. I don't know the exact
So
circumstances.
actually, under monarchy, absolute monarchy, GDPs rose the most because they had centralized bureaucracies that ended like the feudal tariffs. But that's besides the point.
So a removal of tariffs caused GDP to rise.
Not only that, but
That's in line with that is like in line with
it's
what.
political, right? Because generally the absolute monarchs, like in France, like Philip the Ninth, they would align with the free cities as their power base rather than the feudal lords because they were in opposition to each other.
The European Miracle, a book written in 1981, Sudden Rise of Europe During the Late Middle Ages.
Just this, you can find this in like Walter Block, or sorry, Mark Block. My bad, I got the libertarian philosopher. Mark Block, Walter Pyrene.
Hold on.
Pretty much any.
If I read this, he argues that it was the European nuclear family that caused the population Was this not?
And I'm not
There was
citing this
no.
as a source. I'm just giving you an example of someone that talks about it. I
So
haven't read the book. I'm just giving you.
well, okay, yeah, but so what you're doing is you're just saying that here's this thing I vaguely know about where at
I
this
don't
point in
vaguely
time,
know about it. I know I have several citations for it, but this is just showing you that this is a thing.
yeah, but what you're saying is that you're kind of
I can give you
okay.
like I can
I'll
give
give
you a
you an
bunch of
analogy
sources
to
on it
what
right
just.
now, but you
Let me give you an
I'm not
analogy
sure
to
that
what's
you
happening.
I don't think that you actually want to go through and read the sources on the crisis of the 13th century and the European miracle. So I'm not going to give you them, but I Mark Bloch talks about it, Pyrene talks about it. Like everyone, all the standard studies in medieval
Yeah, but
history talk about this.
you're making a jump here because you're saying that I was wrong. Like there's hidden information here. So it would be like if I wonder what a good analogy is. It would be like if I flipped a coin, like I'm flipping a coin in front of you, and you're like, and you're like, okay, like what are the two options, and it's like, oh well, it's either heads or tails, and it's like wrong. I switched it with a Roman denarii, and now it's Caesar's head or like a bull or some shit like that. It's like 30% of the population dying on its own is going to reduce GDP. But apparently 50 to 100 years later there was a GDP boom. Like that's not contradictory to the predictions of economics.
Okay, so then what? But what is it going to? How is it going to predict that? Like, what is it going to predict?
Economics cannot predict the future social
It's
revolutions,
not a
and no,
science.
what science can predict future social revolutions?
That's not the point. So the
Wait, wait, wait,
science.
wait. What science can predict what field of study can do this impossible task? This is an
Can't.
impossible task.
If we took the Kuhn theory of revolutions, you can't predict uh, innovations in science. But that generally, this is the difference between the soft sciences and hard sciences. That past ones aren't necessarily invalidated. That's why we still can use fucking Newtonian physics to predict things, but we can't use invalidated economic theories to predict things because we know they're not true. They're immune to counterfactuals because they're unfalsifiable claims.
Uh, I'm pretty sure. I don't know if that's true because the Phillips curve is still like right sometimes.
It's right sometimes, but that's what I'm saying. It's not a law. It's not. There's no law in economics that makes this true. You would have to know all the relevant social information. This gets to my final point, which is that individuals are fundamentally unpredictable. There's no way that you can have any social science that's going to predict their behavior. And so you're not going to have a science that forms its basis around predicting human behavior correct in any way.
All right, hold on. Before we move on real quick, part of your argument is that economics cannot predict what was it, social revolutions, philosophical revolutions,
Well, either, yeah, religious, etc.
but what field can?
This is why I'm giving you. This is why I'm giving you this last point because this is what distinguishes
Okay, but
the hard
we have to
sciences
move.
from.
That's not a good
But
point
this
against
is.
economics.
This is a point, right? Because those things deal with immutable properties of the universe. You are dealing with mutable properties. This is why I brought up the descriptive prescriptive, because humans, those two things are linked together. So when we need to predict human behavior, which is what economics claims to do, we are trying to do something that they're trying to predict something that is fundamentally unpredictable.
If I gave you, what did you eat tonight?
I ate 2 spring rolls and some French fries.
What'd you have for lunch today?
I had a burrito.
What kind of lunches do you pack when you usually pack lunch when you teach?
Oh yeah, I make some vegan food.
Do you ever go out to
Pasta.
like how often do you go out to like a nice restaurant?
I would usually do that if I'm going on a date or something.
Why? Why don't you go out more?
I budget.
You budget? So what does that mean? So like because there's like a kind of like a constraint on the amount of money you can spend, right?
Yeah, it's very expensive to go out to eat in New York.
Okay. You live in New York City? So if I gave you $1 million, would you go out to eat more?
I probably wouldn't. I probably invest it, but
Yeah, see, you have to lie. You have to
I'm
lie
not
to make
lying.
your point. Yes, you are. Oh my God. Oh my God, dude. If I gave you $1 million, you wouldn't go out to eat any more than you do right now.
I told you I only go out to eat when I go on dates, pretty much.
You wouldn't order dude, come on. You wouldn't increase your level of consumption at all. You would just invest. Oh, I just won $1 million. I'm going to invest all $1 million of it for what? So you can have it at retirement. And then what the fuck do? You spend it in retirement and you have a lavish retirement. Economics predicts that. That's economics. I just predicted your behavior. And you essentially have to, well, all right, I'm not going to keep calling you a liar, but
Well,
I think that that's a little bit dishonest.
do you think that hoarding's a thing?
Yes, some people are hoarders.
Okay, so how do you know if I'm a hoarder or not?
I guess I'd look inside your house.
Well, you wouldn't know, right? You couldn't even know just by looking at my house.
Yes,
Hoarding
and
deals
and
with hoarding deals with money, right? So,
yeah,
if you gave me $1 million, how would you know the difference that I'm a hoarder who's going to put
you're
that million
right.
dollars in the
You're
bank and never
right.
spend it,
Yeah, you
versus
might.
someone who's going to go out and spend it all, right?
Yeah, because you might have a perfectly just a perfectly inelastic demand. You know, I mean, again, it's like we can account for these things, but just because there's edge cases, if I give $1 million to 1 million people, the idea that I can't predict that on average their spending will increase is just ridiculous. When is that going to be the case? Yes, we might have a bunch of monks and they get no preference from consumption, and we can try to model that. We can model a monk where they've experienced ego death. They have no preference over the consumption of restaurant food. But I think it's reasonable to say that if I gave you $1 million, you'd probably be less inclined to skip eating out next time that you're going to go to a nice restaurant.
Let me
Maybe
ask
you'd
you
be,
this:
yeah.
if you did someone who was born during the Great Depression and they were used to hoarding things and saving their money, don't you think the condition of their society would change their behavior?
Why
So
are they
like,
hoarding things and saving money?
well, because of their experience, right?
And what was the experience during the Great Depression?
Well, they live in vast poverty where they were
So they
brought
had
up in
low
those.
incomes. And for normal goods, what does less income do to demand?
No, but what I'm trying to say is that
It
if you gave
reduces it.
someone from that time period $1 million versus
Hmm.
me $1 million, we're going to spend that money differently,
Yes, absolutely. Because
even though it might
different.
give us the same marginal utility, right?
Yes, and if I open up my price theory textbook right in front of me, it's going to say different values subjective, and people have different preferences. That's what we do in intermediate micro. Is we do constraint optimization. We look at people, we model different types of preferences and how different levels of income affect their preferences. Let me ask you this. If I think this is actually a really good point. I'm glad we're talking about this because who do you think holding all, let's say I enjoy Sprite as much as Jeff Bezos does. We enjoy it equally, right?
Uh-huh.
Who do you think is more likely to react to the price of Sprite doubling? Which one of us do you think is more likely to reduce our consumption of Sprite? Or similarly, which one of us would reduce our do you think is more likely to reduce our consumption of Sprite more should the price of Sprite increase? Me or Jeff Bezos?
Oh, you obviously, yeah.
Me. Well, this is something that comes up in neoclassical economics, is that there's two effects within the law of demand. There's two responses to a price change: the income effect and the substitution effect. The substitution effect is the extent to which the price of something changes relative to other prices, and that the relative trade-off between goods changes. The trade-off is the same. The substitution effect has no reason to be different for either of us, because if the price of Sprite doubles, the relative price of Sprite relative to apples has doubled for both me and Jeff Bezos. But because the Sprite takes up a larger portion of my income than it takes up Jeff Bezos's income, I experience a larger income effect. And so you just made a prediction that is very much in line with neoclassical price theory, that because he has a higher income than me, he will have a greater elasticity of demand. Sorry, I will have a greater elasticity of demand in response to Sprite because it takes up a larger portion of my income. That's neoclassical price theory.
I mean, I think that's generally accepted even in heterodox theories, so it's not necessarily what
Yeah, but
he's.
we're not talking about unique. Well, wait. There's never been a contention made so far in this debate about the uniqueness of the observations and predictions we can make. It's just about whether we can make reasonable and useful predictions. We just made a reasonable and useful prediction.
Well,
You made a prediction.
Well, I did kind of focus my critique on macroeconomics and not so much on these micro cases, which are.
Yeah, but microeconomics is, the foundations of economics are, when you said neoclassical price theory is, for all intents and purposes, that is the foundation of modern economics.
Yeah, but these things break down on a macro level. And the last thing I want to say is what we call this is like a trivial truth, right? Because some of the things that you're presenting as neoclassical, I don't think are really in contention in any economic theory. Austrian, Marxist, neo-Keynesian, ecological, like they're not. These are not things that are.
So neo-Keynesian is not a micro theory. That's just macro. Macro is highly debated,
That's what I just
man.
said. Macro, yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay,
I made that clear.
So go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
Oh no, I'm just saying that's what I made it clear at the beginning. Though I'm talking about macroeconomics. I mean, at the micro level, yeah, I would say I would agree with you. We can make reasonable theories because we know what human behavior is like under the current paradigm. That doesn't mean necessarily that paradigm's not going to shift, though. In those
We keep coming back to this current paradigm thing, man. Yeah, dude, I don't know how useful it is to argue that like there's some imaginary paradigm that could exist where supply curves slope down and demand curves slope up. It's like we could imagine a topsy-turvy world where everybody likes being stung by bees all the time. And that's just the universe we live in, and like we measure our utility by how many bee stings we get. It's like you can imagine.
Didn't you argue earlier that there were marginal cases where supply curves slope down?
Do we want to get into that? It's called a long run supply curve, and it's a slightly different scenario. We can get into that if you want to.
But I'm saying like we come
No,
up with
but
all
it's
these
still it's the same.
exceptions.
No. It's not it's not really an exception, because the case of the long run supply curve sloping downward it's not really a supply curve per se. What's happening is the case of the long run supply curve sloping downward is a scenario where demand increases for a product, which causes new firm entry, as competitive models predict. And as new firm entry occurs, firms individually specialize more, thus reducing the average cost of production. And what ends up happening is the new firm entry shifts the short run supply curve to the right farther than the initial rightward shift of the demand curve. And then if you draw a line that connects the original equilibrium point with the new equilibrium point, moving through the long run from one short run to another, we get a downward sloping curve. But that is not the same as a supply curve sloping downward the way Steve Keen argues it, as in like, like a supply curve sloping downward, like prices go down and then people want to produce more of the thing. So it's not really an edge case. It's just a more advanced understanding of long run shifts in markets.
But there would be scenarios where the price goes down and you might want to produce more of the thing, right?
No, what you're gonna do is what you're probably doing is you're conflating cost with price.
Okay, so we want to explain that.
Yeah, the cost of production, if the opportunity cost of providing something falls, we would model that like a rightward shift of the supply curve. Whereas the short run supply curve sloping upward is just about when people talk about a supply curve, they're usually talking about a graphical depiction of the relationship between prices and quantities supplied. So, you know, if we take the market price as given and that increases, sellers are more incentivized to sell their product. What you're thinking of is the cost of providing something falling. So the opportunity cost of something falls, and that shifts the supply curve to the right. That's not a downward sloping supply curve. It's a shift in the supply curve because it fundamentally changes the relationship between the prices and the quantities supplied.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Okay, but we do agree. So that's what I thought you were talking about. But we do agree that with your other scenario, right? There are instances where this paradigm changes, right?
What is the paradigm that is changing?
So we could give an instance where the we could take like 3D printing and like the approaching to zero of the cost of production. Wouldn't that cause a change in the supply curve?
That would shift the supply curve to the right if the cost of production for something goes down.
It's approaching zero, right?
As it approaches zero, we predict that we'd get a higher equilibrium quantity of it. And
So
that's not
the cost would go down and the demand would go up, right?
the quantity demanded would go up.
Yeah.
That's just a basic. You're just describing a shift of the. You're just describing a rightward shift of the supply curve and the equilibrium point moving. If the price of feed that's used to feed pigs increases, what do you think happens to the price of pork chops?
It can go up.
Okay, there you go. That's a leftward shift of supply because the cost of providing something increased.
Yeah. Well, let's get off this because I don't even know why we're talking about this at this point. But my last
Well, we're
point is
still just
going to
talking
be
about the fundamentals. We're just talking about basic econ.
I'm not talking about the fundamentals.
Well, you're talking about the Phillips curve. That's your big.
Well, no, the Phillips curve was just an example of my thing. You didn't even argue about my other points, but that's fine. But so my last point I'm gonna make, and this is just like a game theoretic argument.
Okay.
So basically, if we want to make assumptions about basic human behavior, um, we have to. One, your first assumption is that the other person is going to be unpredictable, correct?
My assumption is that the other person is unpredictable. I guess it would depend on the context, right?
If you're in a game, right? Let's say we're doing like nuclear proliferation.
Okay.
You have to assume both that they will act predictably, but you also have to take into account their unpredictability in regards to that.
Okay.
Correct? You agree with
I
that?
guess.
Okay.
Sure. Okay.
Here's the problem with that. So this leads to an infinite regress. Because that means they have to take into account that you took into account their unpredictability.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to change their behavior in regards to their predictability. Now you, as the first agent, has to take into account their prediction of your unpredictability affecting their unpredictability, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So when we're trying to box in human behavior into certain laws, we're always going to lead to this infinite regress.
What does this have to do with economics?
Well, because economics purports to predict behavior on the idea that humans are fundamentally predictable.
Yeah, but we just made a bunch of predictions, and we agreed that they're probably correct.
They're not necessarily correct. In fact, I've given you several examples from history where they are not correct.
Now, I don't think the example of the 14th century miracle or whatever it was called is an example of it being correct at all. Because you're describing something like there's some other thing happening that neither of us know about that happened.
Well, yeah, it's
Because
human behavior, right? So, and that's what I'm going to say is about you can't predict these things. Like, what economist has predicted the major crises? Who predicted the Great Depression? Who predicted the recession in 2008? Who predicted stagflation? Like, tell me who they are.
there were a handful of people who believed there
But
was a
was it
recession
mainstream?
coming.
Was there mainstream economists that were? Is it the general view that these things were going to happen? No. In fact, the mainstream consensus on all of these things was that they're not going to happen.
So again, I mean, there's always going to be like yeah, I mean, no economist predicted that COVID was going to happen. That doesn't invalidate
It's another good
economics in any
example.
way.
Who predicted that the Greek monetary collapse
I
was
don't
going
think it's a good example because what we can say is that because I could have still in 2019 said if there's a massive black swan global pandemic that shuts down the economy, unemployment's going to go up, there's going to be a recession, and then if we print a fuck ton of money to combat it, then unemployment's going to fall, we're going to recover rapidly, and there's going to be higher inflation. I like that. My inability to predict a black swan event like a virus breaking out is not the same as my ability to predict what might happen if a virus were to break out. They're two separate things.
well, we printed a fuck ton of money during 2008, and it took much longer to get out of that. So what's the difference?
That's a very good point. We printed a lot less. The stimulus was much, much smaller in magnitude. And so it took a lot longer for us to fully recover. And there was less inflation. Longer recovery, lower inflation. And actually, the Phillips curve was correct in these cases.
Well, it doesn't matter if the Phillips curve is correct in some situations. Predict all situations. Right? That's what I'm saying is that even though and this will be my final point because we're approaching an hour. But I'm saying that economics can be a useful tool, mostly because our society is designed around the principles in which govern it. Of course, when I've created a system where printing money is going to regulate the amount of money in the economy, where we've made people dependent on the, I guess, unlimited debt of the U.S. so far as we're able to extend it, and we've made the U.S. dollar the global currency. Of course, these predictions are going to hold true because we've designed it to be that way. But what it can't do is predict things that disrupt that system that we've created, and it cannot deal with revolutionary situations. And in fact, when it tries to dismiss those revolutionary situations, only leg it has to stand on is using theory-laden observations and present them as descriptive.
Should I do a closing statement? Is that
Yeah, whatever you want.
okay? Okay, so yeah, I mean, I don't think again, you're saying economics cannot predict unknown unknowns like major social change that nobody else predicted. There's no field that does it. There's no alternative. So I don't know how much economics doesn't claim to. So there's this thing that economics does not claim to do, and no other field is able to do it. So I don't see that as a good critique of economics. In addition to that, I think I don't think there's been a substantial case made that outside this paradigm that fundamentals like supply and demand don't still apply. Because again, you're just saying, oh, well, let's imagine a Rawlsian scenario where everybody gets a piece of property. Then there's no supply and demand. It's like, well, there's still supply and demand because if I have less of a preference for property than you do, then the property will have less value to me. And we might try to engage in some mutually beneficial trade over that property. And then you said, well, imagine a scenario where you're not allowed to trade. It's like, okay, well, then there'd probably be a black market. And then it's like, okay, well, and then it's like that's still supply and demand working in after this paradigm shift. So I still don't see how uh, economics' inability to predict paradigm shifts that no one else can predict is much of a problem. And I still don't see how fundamental neoclassical things like supply and demand are refuted by theoretical paradigm shifts that might happen.
All right. Well, you have the last word. That was a really fun debate, though.
Yeah, me too. I enjoyed it.
Um, and honestly, this will be off the record, but you always made good arguments to me. So I respect
Thanks.
all of your opinions.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. So I guess we'll end the debate there if you want to stop
Yeah.
recording. And